Hey everybody, time for another game theory video. Remember, if you like the videos, like, sub, silly comment, share, support the channel if you can. I appreciate it. Thanks. Super Chat, PayPal, Patreon, whatever. Again, it doesn't hurt you to leave a like, comment. That does actually help the channel if you do. I appreciate it. Thanks. So I thought, what is something new I can actually talk about on the channel? Although even this video will be relating it to some of my other discussions about video games. So I was thinking, what is a hot take maybe that I have in fighting games? And I guess perhaps something might be that I actually kind of like Dead or Alive. I think Dead or Alive is kind of a fun game. Well, maybe the older ones, right? I think the newer ones, they actually got rid of some of the stuff, like you can't, wasn't it something like in one of the newer games, you can't actually reuse super Azuna drop off of bridges and cliffs anymore. I know they got rid of some stuff that was actually part of the fun, but anyway, but some of the older games are pretty fun. And if you're old enough to remember, or maybe you don't even want to admit, but Dead or Alive 2 back in the day was actually pretty popular. People played Dead or Alive 2 in the arcades. I remember it was not like a unpopular game. It was pretty decently popular. But I do want to relate this to some discussions about video games before, because I do think Dead or Alive does show something that I've talked about before, that you need some guaranteed things in video games, right? There has to be some guaranteed things. Now, I'm not for how video games are, say, nowadays, where, video games are now like a math problem and everything is finding the perfect, setup for this, safe jump this, everything is like guaranteed this, you can't miss combos here, blah, blah, blah. There needs to be some guessing, but I've said before, if we were to compare a game, say, and I'm going to compare, say, Street Fighter Alpha with the rolling, right? Street Fighter Alpha with rolling, and even in Street Fighter Alpha 2, when there aren't guaranteed setups, that can make the game feel kind of spazzy, right? It feels like there's too much guessing, right? It feels a little too volatile, right? I mean, I made that recent video talking about Guy's Hurricane Kick versus, say Balrog's Headbutt, right? You need some guaranteed things, right? Not too many things, not saying like nowadays, right? Where there's, they try to take the guessing out of games, but you need some guaranteed things, right? And a problem, you would say, of a game like, Alpha 2, where you can little punch roll, all that kind of stuff, right? It takes away guaranteed setups. You don't want too much guessing in a game because it makes it feel fake, right? When you have guaranteed things, when you know what you're aiming for, right? It gives you, a goal to strive for, right? But when it feels like guessing is too important in the game, it kind of cheapens it a little bit. And I do think that is probably one of the potentially, oh man, what is with, I can hear the fuzzing from my, I swear I'm having problems with this Blue Yeti microphone and the crapola. It's not even that old. I feel like this thing's only like a year and a half old and I'm already having problems with it. But perhaps one of the more legitimate things that you could think about Dead or Alive that kind of hurt the game competitively is, of course, Dead or Alive has all the rock, paper, scissors. And I think in newer games, they added like, don't they have like, they either have 4 holds or 6 holds or something like that. But whatever the case, there's not a lot of guaranteed stuff in Dead or Alive, right? I think someone can correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's after a few hits, you can then hold in any direction. And even when you knock the guy against the wall, you get one knock against the wall, and then only one hit is guaranteed. Then it's a guessing game again. Even when you hit the guy up into the wall and they bounce again, one hit is guaranteed, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Unless you're juggling, right? But that is something that can, although you could say in a certain perspective, I guess you can say when there's so much guessing, it kind of makes it feel like anybody could win. Maybe it makes it feel like it's kind of like a balancing act almost, right? I do think that kind of, it can make the game feel a little bit cheap, right? Because it's like, oh, well, even if I won, I only won because I kept guessing right. Just like if you lose, it's like, oh, well, I only lost because I kept guessing wrong, blah, 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 right? So maybe that's something that hurt Dead or Alive, right? Other things I think that hurt Dead or Alive when I think about it in the community is, of course, there was a lot of, which is funny because I've said this before. I like Soul Calibur a lot. Well, again, maybe Soul Calibur 1 and Soul Calibur 2. But Tekken was a game I never actually really got into. Tekken just, sometimes a game just doesn't interest you. Tekken just never really interested me. Whereas, say, even a game like Virtual Fighter, I kind of liked Virtual Fighter. Virtual Fighter is a little bit more interesting to me. And again, I know it sounds weird. Dead or Alive just was a little bit more interesting to me than a game like Tekken. I think Dead or Alive is kind of fun, right? When you think about Dead or Alive 2, man, you think about Dead or Alive 2 soundtrack. Man, what a soundtrack that you can listen to. I feel like almost every song in Dead or Alive 2. Maybe not. I think was it like Bass? Is that Bass? Is his name Bass? He's the Hulk Hogan guy. I don't know. There's like a rock and roll song that's kind of eye-rolling, but there's a lot of good songs even in Dead or Alive. It's got a good vibe. It's pretty fun, I think, right? But of course, I remember the game used to get hate from the Tekken crowd, and there was also, around the time that Dead or Alive 2 was gaining more and more steam, if you're old enough to remember, there was a guy named W.C. Maxey, and he actually worked for Bandai Namco. And I don't know how true this story is, but it was like lore in the community that when Dead or Alive 2 was getting a lot of hype in the community, starting to gain some steam, besides, Namco people just in general trying to talk shit about it, there is a story that the W.C. Maxey guy who worked for Bandai Namco went to the Dead or Alive booth at a game show, and he was like, I play Tekken and Soul Calibur, and I can prove that Dead or Alive is a bad game because I can prove that I can beat you in the game. And there's I feel like it, well, maybe not anymore, but when I was in the community a little bit, it was a sort of infamous story that the W.C. Maxey guy, I think he picked Iron or whatever, and he kept, he would do some sort of like wave dash thing, whatever it was, with Iron, and then he would just launch and comboed the guys. He just kept on doing it over and over, and he just beat them or some shit like that, right? I forget, whatever it was. And that guy talked a lot of shit about them, and then I guess he had proof that he beat them, and then so people took, oh, hey, well, if a Tekken and Soul Calibur guy can beat the people that made Dead or Alive at the game, and a lot of people saw it apparently at the game show, that the game must suck, right? Does anyone remember that? God, I'm old, right? God, I'm fucking old. I don't know, but I remember that hurt the game. Which is kind of funny because W.C. Maxey was, I've said this before, I went to Chicago once, and if you're old enough to remember, I'm going off on a tangent now, that remember, Drac used to live with me. And if you're old enough to remember the Tekken community, Drac is a pretty, not anymore, but Drac was a pretty somewhat famous player, right? Like I've heard about Drac. He went to Germany, he won some tournament. He went to Japan, he won some tournament. Again, a blip in the history of fighting game history, but a very interesting person. I've made videos about him before. And Drac is a person, people think I don't practice games. Even when Drac lived with me for a little bit, I never remember Drac practicing. But when Chicago was considered the best at Soul Calibur in the world, Drac went to that Chicago tournament, and there were people like Fetz, Flo, H-Bomb, W.C. Maxey, all these guys. He destroyed every person besides one person, beat him in the tournament, and then Drac got second place, and W.C. Maxey and everybody else went crazy. They're like, no, this doesn't count. They wanted to have another tournament right after that because Drac was just, such again, that's like a weird blip in fighting game history that people, probably aren't old enough to remember because they had the Super Battle Opera. And Chicago was considered the best. And, a lot of people say that Chicago was considered the best because W.C. Maxey worked for Bandai Namco and he let all the Chicago players play the game early. So that's why they were able to be better than everybody else. But that's another, history lesson of video games, right? Like I know this, I'm going off on a tangent. I'm supposed to be talking about or Dead or Alive, but WC Maxey worked for Bandai Namco, and so he had the game early, and then the Chicago players, they just got to play at his house while they were, or he had an apartment, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was, and they just came over to play, and so they had already been practicing the game for a while, but whatever the case, they won Super Battle Opera, H-Bomb, Fets, all these guys, Flo. And Drac went there. Again, I've never seen Drac practice, and Drac destroyed, I don't know who he lost to, but he destroyed everybody but one person, and he got second in the tournament, and they went crazy, and they're like, you got to play again. And Drac was just cool, and he's like, you had your chance, and he didn't, and they had another tournament, and Drac refused to enter. He's like, no, I'm not going to play. You had your chance. Again, that is just, you know what? Me and Drac aren't great friends. You know what I mean? We're two different people, right? And I know it's always funny because people think that Clayton hates the LGBTQ. Drac is pretty fucking gay, dude. He's not the most straight individual, let me tell you. Drac was downloading transgender porn on my computer when he lived with me. Not the straightest dude. And I was like, bro, what are you doing? Like, I mean, but anyway, a very interesting blip that you think about. Again, I never remember the dude practicing, but I've seen that guy beat players that were considered very good at a multitude of games. But anyway, so WC Maxey was a little bit of maybe a bit of a pot stir, you could say, and whatever. But another thing that kind of hurt Dead or Alive too is, I don't know if anyone is old enough to remember, when Dead or Alive was also getting steam in the community, they would do this stupid shit for the game. God, is anyone old enough to remember this? Some tournaments, they would make you pick certain stages to make it seem more exciting for the audience. Does anyone remember when they made you had to play the bridge stage always? And I dare say they made there was some tournament, God, correct me if I'm wrong, and it was a publicized tournament where every stage had to be on the bridge stage, and it was always one round, but they made you play like 10 rounds or some shit weird, because they always wanted to have the first round be that you could knock the guy off the bridge and get huge damage to make it exciting. Like, how retarded is that? Like, when you make certain rules for your game to play, and I was not in the community per se to even know how the community allowed something so stupid to have at tournaments. But I remember tournaments for the game that they would purposely say, you have to pick the most exciting stage. And so for one tournament, you had to pick the bridge stage. And so people might pick Ryu and do the Izuna Death Drop right at the beginning, because God, that's obviously going to benefit him. He's the character that has the huge throw that goes off the bridge for half your life right when the match starts. Wow. So I guess in that sense, Dead or Alive didn't do itself any favor to a more, let's say, a more seriously competitive, let's say, player. That's not a good look to a more serious competitive potential player when you are making rules that you have to play this stage for the entire tournament and it can only be one round. Wow. I can't be the only one that remembers that, but whatever the case, perhaps a hot take of mine is I do think Dead or Alive is actually kind of a fun game. Is it the greatest game ever? No. But I do appreciate Dead or Alive. I know it's a lot of girls and, big boobs and sexualized game. And even looking at it now, I had to find this picture and I reminisced about, there was a time when I would jack off to Dead or Alive. Now I look at it and I think it would be hard as an older man. I guess my perspective has changed just a little bit, but but still, I had to look this up a little bit and I'm like, it's still pretty, I appreciate it for what it is. I don't think it's as terrible as maybe some people believe, but, and relating it to, I do think it shows that you need some guaranteed things in games, because when there's too much guessing, it can make the game feel a little bit cheap. And it feels like you can only get so much better at a game because you can only guess right so many times. And so again, another example of why you do need some guaranteed things in games. If you like the videos, like, sub, silly comment, share, support the channel if you can. I appreciate it. Thanks. Leave a super chat for Ayana's boobs or else she's going to say that you're stupid. The end.